Last year on that day, I was here on the stage again, giving a speech about how disproportionately women and queer people in Palestine and Israel were affected by war, occupation, and religious fundamentalists. I was hoping not to talk again about the ongoing genocide, the hostages still kept by Hamas. I was hoping not to address the deniers of the sexual violence committed by Hamas on 7th of October, the starvation in Gaza, and the right extremist violence in the West Bank. Yet, here I am after a year, seeing that nothing has changed except increasing death tolls, Lebanon being also under a bombardment, increasing anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism, more polarization and more countless shattered lives. We, especially the Palestinians, Israeli and Jewish peace activists, most of whom are not surprisingly women and queer people, are very angry. We have been constantly fighting against the one-sided narrative which only fuels the hatred and brings more destruction. For many times, we have been called to be naive and dreamers because of our dedication for peace and coexistence. We know the root of this is also very sexist and classist. Think about it. Why can't we even think and talk about having peace or coexistence? What made us think that this is impossible? Doesn't it make wars, killings, hate, and destruction the norm? Why am I supposed to think that living in a non-war zone, having a home, having enough food, being able to love and desire whomever I want as privileges? Aren't they basic human rights that everyone must have? Why is it most of the time the marginalized people who keep being reminded of naming these rights as privileges, but not the white, rich, able, cis, hetero people, especially men? Especially on this day, we need to remember that violence is interconnected. The violence of a bomb dropped on Gaza, on Lebanon, on Israel, the violence of a blockade, the violence of taking hostages, and the violence of forced displacement are all tied to the same systems that enable domestic violence, sexual abuse, and gender oppression. Liberation for women and queers cannot be separated from fight against militarism and fundamentalism. Patriarchy thrives in conflict. It silences the voices of women and queer people, marginalizes their experiences, and makes them suffer the most. The Israeli government's militarized policies not only oppress Palestinians but also reinforce patriarchal norms within their own society. Militarism normalizes violence, prioritizes aggression over dialogue, and creates a culture in which women are sidelined from peace-building efforts. Hamas's government in Gaza reinforces patriarchal control and oppression. Their rule has limited women's freedoms, silenced the oppositions, and created an environment of fear for LGBTQ+ people. Hamas' attacks on Israeli civilians are indefensible, and their extremist jihadist ideology won't liberate Palestinians. Both the suffering of Palestinians and Israelis is being exploited for political gain, locally and globally. Governments and extremist groups use the conflict to push their own agendas, dehumanizing those on the ground. Israeli government rhetoric often instrumentalizes the suffering of Israeli civilians and the increasing anti-Semitism to justify ongoing occupation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the military aggression in Gaza and Lebanon. Hamas and extremist Islamic groups exploit Palestinian suffering for propaganda purposes. They frame their actions as resistance while enforcing brutal control over their own people. They use the global outrage over Israel's actions to attract support while hiding their oppressive rule. Also, other governments around the world use the conflict to justify their own policies, stoking fear and division. Rising anti-Semitism and anti-Arab racism in Germany are fueled by political opportunists and extremist narratives. Jewish communities are feeling unsafe, facing attacks and exclusion. Palestinians, Arabs and Muslims are being harassed, marginalized and silenced. Their pain and their calls for justice are being ignored or criminalized. Islamic extremist propaganda is another dangerous force. Groups that claim to support Palestinians are often pushing extremist ideologies that harm the very people they claim to defend. Far-right extremists in Germany, as everywhere, also thrive on this division. They exploit both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim sentiment to spread fear and hate, attacking our movements for equality and justice. In these dark times, it's easy to feel hopeless and divided, but we must remember the power we hold when we come together. True change happens when we build bridges, not walls. When we listen, learn, and uplift the voices of those most affected. As queers and feminists, we know that our strength lies in solidarity, empathy, and action. However, as we speak of solidarity, we must also confront the painful reality of division within our movements here in Germany. Since October 7th, we have seen growing polarization among leftist groups. Instead of fostering solidarity, many have fallen into an unproductive binary, forcing us to choose a side while ignoring the complex realities on the ground. Some refuse to criticize the Israeli government's brutal occupation and the committed war crimes, hiding behind the historical guilt, while others dismiss the suffering of Israeli civilians, denying the humanity of those killed in Hamas attacks. The polarization silences voices of nuance and intersectionality. As leftists, our responsibility is not to defend states or extremist groups, but to stand with oppressed people. All oppressed people. We cannot claim to fight for justice while turning a blind eye to violence that does not fit neatly into our ideological narratives. We must reject both the right extremist violence of the Israeli state and the patriarchal and jihadist oppression of Hamas. Let us unite not around slogans or sides, but around shared values, peace, justice, and equality for all. Let us amplify the voices of women and queer people in Gaza, Israel, and everywhere suffering under violence and oppression. Let us refuse to let polarization divide us and instead commit to the hard, necessary work of building a future where no one is left behind. Let us rebuild our movements here in Germany with a commitment to intersectionality, complexity, and true solidarity. The road to that future is long, but together we can walk it. Thank you.